Here's a question that might really perplex you. What is the deadliest disaster in the history of Canada? That might be particularly perplexing because, as Alan Ruffman, who is an honorary research associate at Dalhousie University, notes, Canadians tend to not dwell upon their disasters. But still, you might think of, for example, the Halifax explosion in 1917, or maybe the sinking of the Empress of India in 1914. You might even harken back to the 1912 sinking of RMS Titanic, which occurred about 400 miles off the coast of Newfoundland. Or I guess if you're a music fan, you might think about the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, which occurred in 1975 in Canadian waters. But actually, the deadliest disaster in Canadian history dwarfs all of those and occurred centuries earlier in the first hurricane in Canada's recorded history. And what's perhaps most surprising is how that great storm became nearly forgotten. But Canada's forgotten storm deserves to be remembered. The Great Storm of September 1775 is in many ways a mystery. In fact, in 1929, following an earthquake and tsunami that killed 28 people in Newfoundland, scientists assumed that the 1775 disaster was related to a seismic event. One even asserted it was caused by an earthquake in Portugal, apparently confusing the date with an earthquake that occurred 20 years earlier in 1755. To make the situation more confusing, no newspapers seem to have been printed in Newfoundland or Nova Scotia in September of 1775. The mistake was actually uncovered by two seismologists, Ann Stevens and Michael Stavely, writing in a 1991 edition of the Bulletin of the Seismological Society of America. They were asking the question if the event in 1775 was, as asserted in 1929, a seismological event. Shouldn't it be included in a seismological history of Canada? In order to set the record straight, they write, this research note presents primary documentation from Newfoundland that shows conclusively that the event in question was a severe meteorological storm unassociated with any earthquake. Thus, it was two seismologists writing in a seismology journal who proceeded to find heretofore apparently unnoticed historical records of a great storm. They found a November 1775 letter from Robert Duff, governor of Newfoundland, to the Earl of Dartmouth. Duff wrote, I'm sorry to inform your lordship that these fisheries, as well as the trade of the island of Newfoundland in the month of September last, received a very severe stroke from the violence of a storm of wind, which almost swept everything before it. Stevens and Stavely note that Duff's description is not consistent with a seismic event, which would not have been associated with a strong wind. Moreover, Duff describes damage to the fishing fleet. A considerable number of boats with their crews have been totally lost. Several vessels wrecked on the shores, and a number of those lying in the harbors were forced from their anchors and sustained much damage. Again, Stevens and Stavely note this is inconsistent with a tsunami, as tsunamis wreak most of their damage in confined inlets, not on exposed points on land, and never on the open ocean. Thus satisfied, it was the two seismologists who determined that the deaths and property damage were related to an extraordinarily severe meteorological storm. The documents they found offered some insight into the storm. Duff wrote that the fishing works in those places mostly exposed were in a great measure defaced, and the waters, which then rose to a height scarcely ever known before, committed great devastation. Two of His Majesty's armed schooners belonging to the squadron under my command, one of which was stationed at the time on the banks and the other on the northeast coast of Newfoundland, were unfortunately wrecked. The Royal Navy vessels, armed sloops, were there to protect the fishing fleet. As to the loss of life, he speculated, I cannot give your lordship a very correct estimate of the damage sustained by the storm, but should imagine from the different accounts given me that the amount of it in shipping, boats, fishing works, etc. cannot be less than 30,000 pounds, and the number of people which perished not under 300. The number 300 is apparently derived from an attachment to the letter sent to the Earl called A General Account of the French Fishery at Newfoundland. In a violent gale of wind, 12 September, 3 vessels wrecked, in which were lost 9,400 quintals of fish and 30 tons of oil. Many boats destroyed and considerable damage done to the fishing works. 20 boats lost at the island of Miquelon and some fishing works destroyed there by a gale of wind the 16th May last. And in the storm of the 12th September, both the French at Miquelon and the island of Saint-Pierre suffered very much, having had 9 banking vessels wrecked. several of their boats totally lost, and their craft and fishing works considerably prejudiced. By adding up his estimate of the average crew per boat, he came to his estimate of 300 dead. However, there was another reference, the Annual Register. First published in 1758 and still published today, it is a respectable reference work. The journal for 1775 gives a shocking account. At St. John's and other places in Newfoundland, there arose a tempest of a most particular kind. The sea rose on a sudden 30 feet. Above 700 boats, with all the people belonging hereto, were lost. Also 11 ships, with most of their crews. Even on shore, they severely felt its effects by the destruction of numbers of people. At Harbor Grace, no fewer than 300 boats were lost. The numbers were repeated in the register the following year, noting the dreadful tempest, the fury of which was chiefly discharged on the shores of Newfoundland. This awful wreck of nature was singular in its circumstances, fatal in its effects. The Grand Banks of Newfoundland are among the richest fisheries in the world. In the 18th century, fishing was almost the singular trade of Newfoundland, and September is the height of the fishing season. In his 2008 book, Hurricane of Independence, Tony Williams explains that fishing crews of sturdy young men between the ages of 16 and 30 came from the west country ports of Bristol and Dartmouth annually to fish the Grand Banks for cod. It was, he notes, dangerous work. A British parliamentary committee estimated that the annual loss of life occasioned by the wreck or floundering of British vessels at sea may be fairly estimated at not less than 1,000 persons in each year. By 1775, Williams writes, thousands of fishermen worked in almost 1,000 boats off of Newfoundland. These fishermen and the women and children who sailed with them to work on shore were particularly vulnerable. In his work on the deadliest Atlantic hurricanes, Edward Rappaport of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's National Hurricane Center wrote, the population on the Atlantic was the most vulnerable to storms through the 18th century. These shipborne explorers, immigrants, combatants, fishermen, traders, pirates, privateers, slaves, and tourists made up the crews and passengers on an uncounted but enormous number of local and transatlantic sailings. Most of the ships traveled to or from the ports of Spain, France, Great Britain, and the Netherlands. They usually proved no match for the intense inner core region of a severe tropical cyclone. Rappaport noted in the St. John's, Newfoundland Telegraph how quickly these storms move. Another common feature among these storms is that they pick up speed as they move to higher latitudes, in terms of how fast the center moves along. As an example, a typical motion might be 10 miles an hour in Florida. It can move much more quickly, on the order of 40 miles an hour, when the upturn occurs. Rappaport also notes that the risk was greater in 1775 because there was no way to predict storms. People 235 years ago wouldn't have had any warning about this impending storm. The online Atlantic Canada newspaper Saltwire wrote, off Northern Bay, the water was calm and thick with men and boats, harvesting the long-awaited bounty. The catch had suddenly become so abundant that almost nobody noticed the ominous orange glow building just over the horizon to the southeast. But some of the older men grew terribly uneasy. One small schooner's captain made a run for it around Salvage Point to Ochre Pit Cove in the hope of safety. The wind quickly built up to a howling gale, and with it came the sea. It rose higher and higher like a wall of destruction. Estimates placed it as much as 30 feet above normal. Very little would survive this power. The deaths at sea were terrible. Williams wrote, sails ripped and were carried aloft, masts broke, waves grew in height to unimaginable heights of 10, 20, 30 feet, maybe higher. Boats filled with water were overturned. Fishermen reached out their hands or jumped in the water to save their friends without thinking on their own safety. But soon there was no one left to help. A BBC weather article explained that a great number of those killed were seamen from Britain and Ireland. The article talks about the boats in Conception Bay. The sea is said to have risen 20 feet higher than usual, putting the vast quantities of the boats in the bay at great risk. The boats really had little chance against the severity of weather at sea. After this appalling weather system had moved on and died down, the beaches were littered with the corpses of the dead sailors. And it's been said that for many years afterwards, bones were still being washed ashore. The Register for 1775 wrote, for some days after, in drawing their nets ashore, they often found 20 or 30 dead bodies in them. A most shocking spectacle. The storm was just as destructive at the French fishing islands of St. Pierre and Miquelon, an archipelago off of Newfoundland that is a remnant of the territory of New France. Saltwire translates a letter from the island's governor. Of 40 French schooners, which were then fishing on the Grand Banks, 22 were lost, almost all belonging to inhabitants of the islands, without counting the loss of 50 shallops, the destruction of numerous scaffolds, and the death of 400 men. On the islands themselves, 18 schooners, 21 shallops, and 3 scaffolds have been broken or submerged. But the death went beyond the ships and boats. The Register in 1776 wrote, "Nor was the mischief much less on the land, the waves overlapping all mounds and sweeping everything before them. The shore presented a shocking spectacle for some time after." And the 1775 edition wrote, "Even on shore they feverishly felt its effects by the destruction of numbers of people." Williams wrote that the hurricane targeted the bays of the eastern end of Newfoundland, hitting almost all the major settlements. As it became apparent that this was a hurricane rather than a common thunderstorm, everyone became terrified and did the best they could to find shelter. Many of the structures that they hid in for shelter, however, were close to shore and held together with mud, moss, and tree bark. It didn't take long for a few large waves and steady winds to rip them apart or blow them down. Saltwire wrote, "In Newfoundland alone, besides the thousands of sailing vessels that were pummeled to pieces and sent to the bottom, the houses smashed and the fishing stages destroyed, untold stores of oil, salt fish, and other provisions were also lost." While there are various records that might attempt to track the storm, the path is simply impossible to prove, as most ships that encountered the storm would have been lost. Ruffman writes, "Like many tropical cyclones, this one may have had its genesis in the Atlantic east of the Lesser Antilles. André Puy recorded a storm that struck Martinique on 25 August 1775 and Santo Domingo 2 days later. The Boston Gazette and County Journal cited reports from St. Croix that a hurricane had happened in the West Indies, which occasioned many vessels from that and the neighboring ports to push to sea. But there's no way to know if that was the same storm. Notably, a hurricane had struck off North Carolina at the end of August, and Rappaport lists the storm as having killed more than 163 people between September 2nd and 6th. Weather historian David Ludland dubbed the storm the Independence Hurricane of 1775 because it struck just as the opening maneuvers of the War of Independence were in progress. The storm played a role in the lead-up to the October 1775 Battle of Hampton, Virginia, the first fighting of the American Revolution south of Massachusetts. But, Ruffman notes, it's not at all clear whether we are dealing with one or more storms, since the Newfoundland reports came 6 to 8 days after the cyclone was recorded inland over the Carolinas. But regardless, we know that the storm struck Newfoundland. Using the information from the National Register, Rappaport estimates the death toll of the 1775 hurricane, which he lists as having occurred between September 9th and 12th, to be approximately 4,000. Saltwire gives perspective to that number. When you consider the summer residency on the island at the time was only between 8 and 10,000 people, you can really get an appreciation for the loss. Almost half the population wiped out. It is difficult to imagine how terrible it must have been to face this tempest without warning, without any ability to defend yourself. But almost as shocking is how quickly the memory of this event faded. It was nearly forgotten until the 20th century, and even then researchers often got the date wrong. It wasn't until 1991 that someone bothered to do enough research to determine that it was a hurricane and not a seismic tsunami. Ruffman notes that the Atmospheric Environmental Branch of Canada has no file on this storm, the deadliest storm in Canadian history. He laments that it has become essentially forgotten. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.